Okay, so welcome to the T214 Sound Design UT1 revision. Alright, the live one was held on Friday, 6th June, so this is an electronic one, a video kind of one. Let's get moving. First thing, some important notes about UT1. First of all, please make sure you download the UT1 audio package from Leo. So it will be up by this weekend or by Monday. Please download it before the UT. Don't wait until the last minute. It is encrypted. There's a password. You'll get the password on the UT day itself. Please bring along your own headphones or earpieces. You are not allowed to share, right? You'll be notified when to use them for your audio package. Bring along a pen. You may have to do some drawing, some diagrams, so please bring along a pen. You'll be given the paper though. It's an open book UT, but you're not allowed to have any loose papers or physical notes. However, you may use UT notes on your computer, like 6Ps and resources. Answer in your own words. Do not copy and paste. This is called plagiarism. If you're caught for plagiarism, you will at the very least get everything in that question wrong. You could even fail the exam, and worst case scenario, you can be brought before a disciplinary committee and be expelled from school. Alright, lastly, please make sure that your UT client is the latest version. It's UT client 6.01. This solves a lot of the issues that have been plaguing this UT1 first week or two, okay? So first of all, lesson 1 was seeing sound. So let's review a few things. The key to this is the ability to critically listen, to determine the sound source and key characteristics and artistic potential of sounds. All right. You need to also be able to orally recognize and explain all the physical properties, things like frequency, amplitude, and spectrum. Now, frequency, just in case you've forgotten, is how fast the wave moves. All right, the sound wave moves. Amplitude is a measure of pressure. This is often perceived by the human ear as how loud something sounds, but it is distinctly different than loudness. And the spectrum is the range of frequencies that are audible, at least to the human hearing. So be able to explain those, all right? Be able to explain acoustic communication, all right? Basically, we're talking about how sound is produced, travels, and is perceived, all right? So as it says here, it's produced when an object vibrates. Okay, this vibration causes the molecules in the air to vibrate and travel through. Now, it needs a medium to travel through, either a gas, a liquid, or a solid. Right? And then these sound waves are perceived, usually by people with their ears. However, we can have electronic perception. If you have a microphone that perceives things as well, but that's a different story altogether. All right? Okay, moving on, you need to be able to explain the term psychoacoustics. Now, in short, psychoacoustics is the study of human hearing, but be able to explain it beyond that. Just don't say it's the study of human hearing. That won't suffice. Be able to explain what all of that means, right? Using a spectrum analyzer, you may be asked to describe how you would use a spectrum analyzer, or you might be shown a spectrum analyzer. Okay, so be able to describe it, know what a spectrum analyzer is, how it helps you to visualize the attributes of sound, which are listed here as frequency, amplitude, duration, harmonics, room ambience, right? And you need to be familiar with industry terminology, right? You can't say just waves. You have to say frequency waves or sound waves. You can't say how loud something is. You have to talk about the amplitude or the volume of something, things like that, all right? So, in short, lesson 1 was critical listening, and it really is looking at recognizing frequency, amplitude, and even spectrum. We're looking at recording quality and types of effects processors, which we'll actually cover in a later lesson down here. All right. So let's move on to lesson 2, which was the introduction to digital audio. Now, for this, in the UT, you will need to be able to explain and identify the different components which constitute a digital audio workstation. These are listed in the 6P for this lesson, I believe. right? You also need to be able to differentiate between input and output devices, right? Hardware and software counterparts, right? What are the hardware things, what are the software parts, right? You need to be able to explain how you will set up a DAW to support audio recording, editing, music arrangement, mixing and mastering. Now, mixing and mastering, we really haven't touched too much on, but we will be getting into that a little bit later. However, it is in there because you did a little bit of mixing and mastering in there. Be able to explain audio fidelity, right? We're looking at sampling frequency and bit depth resolution. Now, some of you are still a little bit puzzled by what is this sampling frequency and bit depth. What does this mean? Well, imagine that sampling frequency is the same thing as frames per second in a video, right? Sampling frequency is how many times that a sound is sampled. Now, when we talk about 44.1, that means it's sampled 44,100 times per second. Okay, that would be like the frame rate of a video. And bit depth resolution, we normally talk about 8-bit, 16, 24, right? And so bit depth is really about the depth of the resolution of it. And you think about this as your video resolution. Is it 1080p or is it 720 or 480, whatever the case may be? What is the resolution there? Okay, so that's really like that's what bit depth is to sound. It's what resolution is to video. Okay, I hope that helps. Use industry terminology, right? Be able to know what the terms stereo, input, output, monitor, nonlinear editing, decibels, and dynamic range all mean. Right? So here we go. Digital audio workstation. So in short, we've got be able to know what the connections are, diagrams, signal and signal flow. All right. The components of a DAW. You need to be able to know what the sampling rate is. I just explained that, as well as bit depth. Lastly, the types of cables. Now, you may not have paid too much attention to the different types of cables, but we have several different types of cables. So there's the XLR, right? There is an 1/8 inch jack. There is a 1/4 inch with a ring tip. There's a stereo 1/4 inch, right? We also have RCA cables. If you don't know what those are, you better go look them up. Alright, lesson 3. Setting up and configuring a field recorder. In this case, I think most of us use the H4n Zoom, and hopefully you know all about that by now. Be able to select the input levels to balance the sensitivity with the noise floor, okay? So the noise floor is the ground, the basic noise level that we would have, alright? You need to know about connecting external microphones with this field recorder. Now, the H4n accepts both XLR and 1/4 inch cables, right? Microphones can be hooked up. We can have 2 external microphones hooked up to this. Okay, you need to know about how to record narration using different microphones. In this case, we experimented with condenser mics and dynamic mics. Know what the difference is between these 2 microphones, right? You need to know about transferring audio recordings from a field recorder to a computer. Most of the time we just use the SIM card, but you can also hook it up via USB. Right? As I mentioned, know the difference between a condenser mic and a dynamic mic. Alright? What are the recording properties? How do they handle? What are the different operations? Okay? And what about polar patterns? So this is how a microphone will actually pick up sound. What's the frequency response? How sensitive is it to the frequencies on the low end and on the high end? Right? So you need to be able to look at those things in the graph. Using close miking and distant miking. What are those techniques used for? When is it an advantage and disadvantage? Hint, take a look at the script that you had used for this podcast. It kind of describes that there. Right? So in short, we're looking at recording. We're looking at close and distant miking. We're looking at the different types of microphones. the polar patterns for these and the frequency response for these microphones. Alright, lesson 4 was part 2 of this podcast, where you had to do editing. So you had to create and configure a multi-track system. Right? You had to use Pro Tools, you had to create multi-tracks in there and import your sound files. So you had to choose and configure sample rate and bit depth. In case you forgot, 44.1 at 24 bits, that's what we had you use. Okay, you had to be able to create tracks. Hopefully you know how to create a track in Pro Tools by now. You have to be able to differentiate between audio tracks and other kinds of tracks. Now, we really haven't looked at too many other kinds of tracks, but at the very least you should know what a stereo track looks like and a mono track. Alright, now we have got configure signal routing for stereo monitoring. Alright, and the importing of digital WAV files. Now, digital WAV files can be imported in a number of ways. You can actually go into File and Import. You can actually drag and drop them in. Okay. You have to be able to navigate a session, find your way around the session file, and you have to be able to optimize the computer for using Pro Tools. Right, and backup, saving and backing up your session files. Be familiar with the industry terminology. These are the same terms that I've mentioned before, so please get to know them. Use editing tools to perform edits such as trimming, splicing, and crossfading. Also, you need to know about destructive and non-destructive editing. Right? You should be familiar with some of the keyboard shortcuts, like the zoom, trim, selector, grabber, scrub pencil. Okay, these are all the ones that are in Pro Tools, and if you remember, you've got the selector, the grabber, and the trim, and if you click on the little bar above those, you get the Smart tool. Alright, the different types of modes. We have shuffle and spot, slip, and grid mode. Now, we've only concerned ourselves with the slip mode and the grid mode, so you shouldn't worry about the others at the moment. But you need to be able to know what these ones are. Okay, the ruler views, this is how we measure the occurrence of time or the progression of audio. So we can either measure it through bars and beats, which we really haven't done yet, or minutes and seconds, which is what we have as default on Pro Tools at the moment. Right? Mix and bounce 2 tracks, one mono and one stereo. So how do you mix and bounce these 2 tracks into a WAV file or an MPEG file? Right? And how do you edit the tracks and voiceovers? Okay, you have to be able to control a simple mix between the 2 sources using possibly the mix window or the edit window. All right. So in Pro Tools editing, we're looking at session settings, editing tools, the edit window, the editing modes, and the mix window. Now just remember, the mix window is the one that's got all the fader looking buttons, and the edit window is where you can actually see your sound clip in there. Alright, editing modes, slip, shuffle, grid, and spot. Alright, editing tools, things like the selector, the grabber, trimmer, things like that. And your session settings, again, as I mentioned, when you first open up your session, you're asked to create a session, choose your frequency, your sampling rate, as well as your bit depth. Right? Lastly is solo and mute and inserts. So we learned about inserting effects. All right, and what's the difference between solo and mute? When would you use those 2 things? All right. Lastly is lesson 5. Now this is when we used effects processing, or in this case, we call it audio signal processing. Okay. We had 5 effects that we had to work with, so you need to know those 5 effects. And you have to be able to configure the channel strips to direct the audio regions through the processing. Right? So how do you put in the processing filters or effects into a track? Refer to the unprocessed by reverb and delay as dry and processed audio as wet. So what is dry audio and wet audio? Basically, dry is unprocessed, wet has been processed. Right? This is in particular to reverb, delay, and probably even chorus. Right? you have to be able to explain or describe how you would apply audio effects to achieve a desired result. Okay, so in this case you have to think about what the desired result is and identify the effect that would be the most useful. So how would you enhance the mix? What about the artistic side of it? How are you going to create space, the sense of auditory space? Okay, using reverb. What about affecting the timbre? Okay, possibly using chorus or phaser. Okay, be able to recognize and talk about the sound effects. Now we had 5 sound effects, and they're listed here as reverb, delay, chorus, pitch shift, and phaser. Now, while your team may have only focused on one, you do need to know what all of these are. Okay, you should be able to compare analog tape sound manipulation with digital equivalents. We talked about this a little bit in the 6P for this, so you should go back and look at some of that stuff. Okay, and we're looking at insert formats. So effects are often plugins or filters, and different DAWs will use different formats. So things like Audacity or Cubase or Reason will use a VST. GarageBand and Logic Pro, which are Apple DAWs, will use AUs or audio units. And Pro Tools has just moved to a new audio unit called AAX, but you also should be aware of the other ones that are used with Pro Tools. Okay, so in short, effects processing, EQ, okay, so equalization, what is it, how does it work, how does it affect frequencies, how do you manipulate frequencies using EQ. Your 5 effects, reverb, delay, chorus, phaser, and pitch shift. What is dry versus wet in terms of sound, and the parameters for adjusting these different things. So what about the parameters that you use when you adjust? Okay, so these are the 5 lessons that we're going to be tested on, testing you on for UT1. I would suggest you go back. As you can see, there's actually a lot here to study. Don't rely on just your notes to give you the answers. It's not going to happen that way. You need to actually go and study. Okay, so good luck, and I hope this video has been useful. Thank you very much. The end.